The Boston Molasses Flood of 1919 by Lauren Tarshish. 95 years ago, a strange and terrible disaster struck Boston. A killer wave of molasses crashed through a crowded neighborhood. The wave was 15 feet tall, traveling at 35 miles per hour. It destroyed everything in its path and killed 21 people. How did this happen? And who was to blame? It was a bright January day in 1919, and young Anthony DeStasio hurried along a crowded sidewalk in Boston's North End. As usual, the streets were crowded with honking motor cars and clattering horse-drawn wagons. After weeks of freezing cold, the day was warm and sunny. Anthony's tattered wool coat flapped over as he hurried toward the tiny apartment where he lived with his parents and three sisters. Like most of the people who lived in this poor Boston neighborhood, Anthony's family had come from southern Italy, eager to start a new life and start a new and better life in America. What they found was hardship. Anthony's father worked long hours on the waterfront. Anthony's mother struggled to make their dingy two-room apartment into a decent home, to chase away the cockroaches and cover up the stink of garbage and horse manure that wafted up the streets. Life was tough for the people of the North End, and the past 2 years had been especially challenging, not only for them, but for most Americans. World War I had been raging in Europe. More than 4 million American soldiers had joined the brutal fight to defeat Germany. During the final months of war, another horror hit the world, the influenza epidemic of 1918. 50 million people had died, including more than 600,000 Americans. Now, though, the war and epidemic were over. Anthony might even have sensed a mood of hopefulness on that bright January day. The residents of Boston's North End had every reason to believe that better times were just ahead, but they were not. Something terrible was about to strike Anthony's neighborhood. In fact, the deadly threat had been looming over the North End for years. It was not a German bomb or a deadly disease. It was a giant steel tank filled with molasses. From pies to bombs. Molasses is a thick brown syrup that was once the most popular sweetener in America. Like white sugar, molasses comes from the sugarcane plant, which grows in the Caribbean and other hot and humid regions. Until the late 1800s, white sugar was so expensive that only rich people could afford it. Molasses was the cheap alternative. So, despite the bitter taste, it was molasses that sweetened early America's tasty treats like pumpkin pie and Indian pudding, a cornmeal-based dessert. By the 1900s, sugar prices had dropped and most Americans no longer needed to sweeten their foods with molasses. So the sticky brown syrup was put to a new and surprising use, making bombs. Heated up in a process called distillation, molasses can be turned into industrial alcohol. In this liquid form, molasses became a key ingredient in the explosives used in the war against Germany. Throughout World War I, ships loaded with millions of gallons of molasses arrived at Boston's ports. Trains would then take the gooey cargo to distilleries where it was turned into industrial alcohol. In 1914, the leaders of one molasses company, United States Industrial Alcohol, decided to build an enormous molasses storage tank near Boston Harbor. The tank was constructed hastily, and it was huge, bigger than any tank ever built in Boston. As if the North End weren't already grim enough, now a 5-story steel tank towered over the neighborhood, blotting out the sun and blocking the view of the harbor. It wasn't only the tank's unsightliness that upset the residents of the North End, though. A few hours after the tank was filled with molasses for the first time, brown syrup began leaking from the seams, oozing like blood from invisible wounds. Every time the tank was refilled with molasses, it rumbled and groaned, as though the steel walls were crying out in pain. Some people living near the tank worried it was unsafe. But what could they do about it? USIA was a big company, and the people of the North End were poor and powerless. In the early 20th century, many Americans viewed immigrants with suspicion and prejudice. Prejudice. Even a person bold enough to complain about the dangerous tank would have had a hard time finding someone willing to listen and help. And so the years passed, the molasses kept leaking, and the noises of the straining steel grew louder, until the moment on that bright January day in 1919 when Anthony DeStasio was making his way home. Violent swirl. The first sign of disaster was a strange sound. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat-tat. It was the sound of thousands of steel rivets popping out of place. After years of strain, the molasses tank was breaking apart. People froze and then became a thundering explosion. "Run!" a man screamed. "It's the tank!" Anthony looked up just as the molasses tank cracked apart like a massive egg, unleashing 2.3 million gallons of thick, sticky molasses. The molasses formed a colossal brown wave, 15 feet high, 160 feet wide, and traveling at a staggering 35 miles per hour. The syrup was far heavier and more destructive than a wave of ocean water, and it moved with incredible power and speed. Within seconds, it had crushed several wooden houses and flattened a 3-story fire station. It swept away motor cars and snapped electrical poles. Anthony and dozens of others were quickly caught in the violent swirl. The wave pulled Anthony under. Molasses gushed into his mouth. He was carried for several blocks until he crashed into a metal lamppost, hard. The impact knocked him out. A firefighter, spotting Anthony pinned against the lamppost, rushed through the waist-down molasses and grabbed Anthony just before he could be swept away. The firefighter held Anthony's limp body and looked at his molasses-coated face. The poor boy, the firefighter believed, had not survived. By the time the wave lost its power, half a mile of the north end was flooded with molasses. Hundreds of firefighters, police officers, nurses, and sailors from docked ships rushed to the scene. They freed people trapped under collapsed buildings and tangled in molasses-soaked debris. Plain water did little to wash the thick, syrupy molasses away. Instead, firefighters used salt water to scour the hardening goo from the streets. In the end, 21 people were killed and 150 were injured. The strangest disaster. Within hours of the explosion, leaders of the USIA were insisting that the disaster was not their fault. Their tank, they claimed, had been bombed by criminals. But few believed this explanation. In the following weeks, experts sifted through the wreckage, inspecting the remains of the tank. They spoke to residents who had seen the leaks and heard the strange noises. The experts' conclusion? The tank had been shoddily built, and the leaders of the USIA had known it. Still, USIA refused to take responsibility, and at first it seems that the company would not be held responsible. But the victims persisted in their demand for justice. They filed a lawsuit, and the trial dragged on for years. Finally, USIA was forced to pay $1 million, equal to about $7 million today. For the poor immigrants of the North End, it was a big victory. It took years for the North End to rebuild after the flood. Even today, on hot days, some claim that the sweet smell of molasses rises up like a ghost. But somehow, this disaster has been largely forgotten. Indeed, few have heard of the molasses flood of 1919 and the incredible stories from that day, like the story of Anthony DeStasio. Anthony was taken to a large building used to store the bodies of those who had died in the flood. He was covered with a sheet. But Anthony wasn't dead, only unconscious. Hours later, he woke up to the sound of his mother's voice calling him. He tried to answer, but his mouth was filled with molasses. Suddenly, he sat up, and soon his family surrounded him. a lucky survivor of one of the strangest disasters in American history.